let's start by the resurrection, because I didn't really get to touch on that much in my last rebuttal. You mentioned that the earliest gospel doesn't have any resurrection appearances, and as you acknowledged,
yes.
It says in Mark 16, the angels tell the disciples to go and tells the woman to go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So there is a implication that there's going to be appearances. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, which is an earlier account, does mention more appearances than any of the Gospels.
500.
Yeah.
Of course, I've always found that quite strange, the reference by Paul there to the appearance to more than 500. This is, I believe, the only account of such an event happening. I wonder kind of who these 500 are, if they ever thought to write anything down, if there's any other account of 500 people having seen this kind of stuff. We're not sure why it is that Paul knows this is the case. He doesn't give an account of where he got this information. It seems to me at least plausibly something that could be false, right? It's not, in other words, it's not like extremely well established that Jesus did appear to a group of 500 people.
No, I agree with you. That I don't think the appearance of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15 is a strong evidential value. It's not a major line of argument for me. I'm just challenging your assertion that there's a developmental trajectory.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, which is fine, of course. You recognise that does exist within the Gospels. The only exception being here one reference by Paul in a letter, which, of course, we've got kind of no actual narration of the appearance. We've just got somebody saying that he's essentially heard that this is something that Jesus had done. Our earliest accounts of an actual narration of Jesus appearing to people don't exist in our earlier sources, except, of course, to the appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus, which would be an example of a group hallucination. But funnily enough, I find this quite interesting, is that it's often said that, well, the disciples couldn't have been essentially hallucinating because of the fact of group appearances. You don't get group hallucinations. But the only early account that we have of a group hallucination, that is the appearance to Paul and his travelling companions, is one in which the companions don't also see the appearance. It's just Paul. Which I find quite strange. But I'm dubious of
But
this.
they do have sensory perceptions of the encounter. But be that as it may, I did want to ask about, because coming back to your developmental scenario, Mark, we don't know what he would have gone on to say, because he finishes his account very abruptly. Scholars debate over whether Mark is completely intended to finish there, or whether he actually had an ending that subsequently got lost from verse 9 and following. So we don't really know what Mark would have said. And then Matthew and Luke are written approximately around the same time, and Luke doesn't seem to be literally dependent upon Matthew. So really your only data points are Matthew and Luke and John in terms of your developmental trajectory.
Sure, but of course the lack of the appearance narrative in Mark is part of that trajectory. Of course, this could be explained partly by that trajectory, or perhaps by the fact that he did write it and it got lost, or he just decided not to write it, of course. But I'm just kind of using the evidence that's being presented to me here, which are 4 Gospels, the first of which contains no resurrection appearances. And I'm thinking, what might explain the fact that as time goes on, the fancifulness of the stories seems to increase. Indeed, ending in John, the final edition, with the addition of Doubting Thomas, which seems to be a moral lesson against requiring evidence for belief. Of course, after Thomas touches the wounds of Jesus, Jesus says that it's, he now believes, but blessed are those who believe without seeing. He believes because he's seen. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. So what we get is, the further away we get from the actual events that are being reported, the more fanciful the stories, culminating in a story that has a moral lesson advising people that they shouldn't desire to believe on the basis of evidence. This seems to me strange.
So that's not what John's saying there at all. In fact, in the very same chapter, he goes on to say, John, the author, goes on to say that these things are written that you might believe that he is the Christ and thus have life in his name. In terms of what he says in verse 29 to Thomas, he's chiding Thomas for not having believed in sufficient evidence, because he had the testimony of the other apostles. He'd been with Jesus throughout his ministry and observed the miracles and so forth.
Of course, John is writing at the end of John why he wrote his gospel, but
right.
I'm quoting the words of Jesus, right? So there's kind of there's a disanalogy here, or a difference here, which is that Jesus is saying, you believe because you've seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. It's then John who says, oh, but I decided to write this down so that people will come to believe. That it's kind of 2 separate sources there.
Sure. So, first of all, I gave an explanation for an interpretation of what I think Jesus is saying. And secondly, Jesus, if you look elsewhere, for example, in Matthew 11, when John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus, are we the one we're expecting, or should we wait for another? He says, well, go back to John, tell him what you hear and see. And talks about the miracles that he's been performing. right? He talks about the sign of Jonah and his resurrection as being evidence for his incarnation and divine identity.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there like a question?
Yeah, so I'm objecting to that particular point, that Jesus does seem to affirm approaching this topic evidentially.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. That would be fine. I'd be fine to just kind of drop that point about John, but I'm not really sure if we should.
Okay.
It seems to me that seems to be the most natural reading of Doubting Thomas. You're saying that the story should in fact be interpreted as Jesus basically saying, "You have believed because you've seen a lot of evidence. Blessed are those who believe having seen sufficient evidence," or something like this.
Yeah, so Thomas was discontent with having sufficient evidence, that he should have believed on the basis of what he already had. And God doesn't take well to people not believing when they've already got sufficient evidence.
Right, I see. That might be plausible. I'm happy to look into it.
I did want to ask you, though, about your low intrinsic probability of miracles.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So can you justify why you come to that conclusion?
I guess the point that I was kind of trying to make there was to say that in the context of this discussion, do you expect a naturalist to take as seriously the hypothesis that a man rose from the dead as he should take the hypothesis that, say, Jesus didn't die or something? Like, in other words, like, I suppose you're not surprised that somebody would not do that, but you're saying that they're being kind of, irrational in doing so?
Correct.
Because in assuming that something like a miracle would have a lower intrinsic probability?
Exactly. So I'm interested in what your justification is for assigning such an intrinsically low probability to miracles.
Well, wouldn't you say, like as you said, the fact that this doesn't happen elsewhere would not be a good response because that's what we'd actually want. This is what
we'd expect.
Is trying to do. He's trying to put forward a unique event. Could not the same be said that the reason why the resurrection is a powerful vindication of Jesus' message is because it has a low probability of occurring, and so that makes it miraculous that God did it, right? Like, it seems to me that the intuitive force of saying, isn't it amazing that Jesus rising from the dead, isn't it amazing that happened and this vindicates his message, is because of the fact that we should expect this to be so improbable that if it really did happen, this provides strong evidence. And I also wonder if you think that it would provide the same evidence as any other miracle. That is, I don't know why it is that rising from the dead specifically, except maybe the fact that he predicted it, would be any more of indication of his divinity than his ability to turn water into wine. If there was an instance of him having predicted that he would go on to do that and then did that, this seems equally miraculous. This is I don't see why the resurrection in particular would offer a vindication.
Sure. So for a number. Okay, so I'm trying to formulate a question. So Isaiah 53:10, for example, speaks about the resurrection in the context of messianic prophecy. Jesus himself says that the resurrection will be the vindication of his messianic divine self-claims. And so it's very surprising if God raises Jesus from the dead if he's a false Messiah, for example, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. Yeah. I think that answers it quite well, I think.
So
I'd like to talk about Paul, if we can. I tried to ask a moment ago what it is you think about the conversion of Paul specifically that bears on the divinity of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, very quickly then. So in if we read the book of Acts, chapter 9, I would argue that Acts was written by a traveling companion of Paul, and I think that we can show with a high level of confidence that the account in Acts 9 concerning Paul's conversion actually most likely reflects Paul's
I'm willing to grant that.
Yeah. It seems to me that Paul is sincere in his conviction that Christ appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And that's clear from the way that Paul converts to Christianity against his own self-interest.
The first thing, okay, so there's the point about self-interest and there's the point about him appearing to Paul. Sometimes the conversation goes something like this. Somebody will say that, well, maybe the disciples were just lying. Yep. And one response to this is to say, well, this can't be the case because Jesus actually occurred to some people, which included his enemies, such as Paul. Right. But you recognize that the appearance to Paul is nothing like the kinds of appearances that are described at the ends of the Gospels. Sure. That is, it's not a physical Jesus, there's not a man who walks up to Paul, but rather just a bright light and a voice that he hears.
But notice that there is a sensory experience that it has upon his traveling companions. Yes. And also notice that he's blinded, he's healed by Ananias.
Yeah, there's an interesting study about that actually, in terms of like somebody having an epileptic fit and its ability to cause temporary blindness. It's actually remarkably similar to the experience of Paul. And of course the other his companions are said to have kind of heard what was said. It's possible that was reported because like Paul might have just told them or something like this. It's at least plausible. They certainly didn't see the vision that Paul saw. Of course, there's also this point about the fact that Paul was a persecutor, so why would he suddenly sort of start believing in Jesus on the basis of this appearance? I think it's quite easy to say or to suggest that somebody who's engaged in the persecution of Christians would have something like a kind of guilt-driven appearance of Christ. I mean, you could make an analogy, for instance, to a lot of vegans will tell you that one of the reasons that maybe they went vegan, I've heard this a few times, is that they used to eat meat all the time, and they were watching factory farm footage, they just didn't really care, and then they had this dream where a cow appears to them and says, Jonathan, why are you persecuting me? And they say, why are you forcing me into a gas chamber? And then they wake up and they go, oh my gosh, and from that day onwards they become a vegan. Now I could say that, well, the fact that somebody just had this vision, and especially if they had it in the daytime and with a blinding flash of light and they thought it was kind of not a dream, in other words, I could say that their sudden conversion to veganism is best explained by the undeniable truth of veganism, or I could say that it's because they were feeling guilty about what they've just done. And if Paul has just overseen the stoning of, who is it? The stoning of Stephen, thank you. The stoning of Stephen, he's watched this take place. He goes on a long walk with lots of time to think to himself. Don't you think it's not too surprising that he might have something like an experience driven by guilt, and that would explain why a persecutor becomes a Christian, not the truth of Christianity.
Short response,
okay.
Yes.
Briefly, so yeah, that's a possibility, but is it probable? So, for example, Paul describes in Philippians 3:4-6, he says, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness, under the law, blameless. He seems quite content in his former ways of Judaism. Also, in regards to guilt-based conversion. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders says that women are 5 to 1 times more likely to experience conversion psychosis. Also, adolescents, military persons in battle, people of low economic status, and those with a low IQ are also more likely prone to experience this phenomenon, and Paul doesn't seem to fit that reference class.
Thank you. That's all we have time for. Sorry.
The full conversation that the clip you just watched was taken from is available via the link that just appeared on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.